I would apologise for how dark and miserable it looks right now, but I feel like it's thematically on point. We're going to talk about the worst books I read this year. Well, to be fair, I feel like my reading year overall in 2024 was just like mid. I read about 110 books, and by the end I only had 6 books that I was like obsessed with, really passionate about. And in contrast, I would say that there is only 1 book that I hated this year that I'm kind of angry at. Having said that though, I have always held that one of the worst things a book can do is be boring. And so while the books that are going to grace this list of my most disappointing reads in 2024 aren't necessarily like the worst books I've ever read, I am still mad that I wasted my time on them. Before we get to my worst, most disappointing reads of 2024 though, I thought I would briefly tell you about the DNFs, all of the books that I did not finish in 2024. I DNF'd The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. It was my first Leigh Bardugo. I've heard nothing but incredible things about this author. I don't even remember how far I got in, but it was a decent way. I want to say like at least 100 pages. And there's not that there was anything that I could point to and tell you that this is a horrible book. Instead, it just never hooked me. And it's an historical fantasy set during the Spanish Inquisition. Like, how do you make that boring? Nimona was a graphic novel that I DNF'd this year. Again, nothing necessarily wrong with it, but it never hooked me. At the time that I read it, I put it down to the fact that Nimona was originally published as a webtoon, so like the chapters were episodic. And so by the time I was like 5 chapters in, there was still no kind of like overarching storyline, still no thread that was tying everything together that gave me a sense of where we're heading. And obviously graphic novels are such a short medium. So to be that far into the book and still not feel in it, like, I don't know what to tell you. I'm not pushing through that. Honeybees and Distant Thunder, a highly acclaimed translated book, and I hated the writing. Hated the writing. I read this very early on in the year, back in January, so I don't remember like the specifics, but I remember vividly there being like really short sentences, and like each sentence sometimes would be like its own paragraph, and it all just read so stilted to me. Haldol and Hyacinths by Melody Moise. I got through about half of this book. I went in with very high expectations, to be fair, because Melody Moise is the author of one of my favorite nonfiction kind of biography memoir books I've ever read. Haldol and Hyacinths though had like none of the charm, none of the introspection, reflection, and none of the poetry that the Rumi Prescription did, and I just found it utterly cold, which is not what you want from a memoir. The Daughters of Izdihar, I DNF'd this pretty quickly. I was like maybe 3 chapters in. I don't even remember what the setting is supposed to be, but I remember that where this book is set was one of the main draw cards for me. And yet 3 or 4 chapters in, there was like no atmosphere. There was no world building. This book could have been set anywhere, anytime. And I just do not care for that. That is one of my least favorite things in a book, so DNF. Some Desperate Glory. I feel like this is a book I probably, like, if I came across it secondhand, maybe I would try it again. I think the thing is, it just felt so YA. It was marketed as adult, so I went into it expecting an adult novel, and yet almost immediately, like, it just felt so angsty. It felt like we were going to lean into like a coming of age kind of narrative. The characters were all so young, both literally in age, but also just, you know, in vibe, in personality. And even just like the pacing and the way that it was setting up, like it felt young adult to me, which is fine. I'm literally a children's bookseller. I love children's books, but I like to have my expectations set accordingly, and that was not the case for this one. Chlorine. Chlorine is a much beloved horror novel over the last couple of years, and I understand why. It's doing some really interesting things. I just didn't like the way that it was doing them. I think I said something along the lines of that some of the horror elements felt like edgy Tumblr shit from 2014. And as somebody who lived through that era, I stand by that. Thunderbird. This is a Palestinian middle grade, and it's so short. It's literally like 130 pages or something, and I got about halfway through it. And it's by an author that I have read from and loved before, and yet here her storytelling did not work. The pacing was terrible. Halfway through a very short book and there's literally no intrigue. Like, what? The Minotaur Takes a Cigarette Break, my fastest DNF of the year. I DNF'd it 8 pages in. And I literally read out a paragraph or 2 from this book in a vlog, which I'll leave a link to in the cards above for you if you wanna hear how gross this was. But basically it was just one of those cases of men writing women terribly. And it happened like 2 or 3 times in the first 8 pages. So I just knew that this was not a book for me. And then The Temperature. This is an Australian, I think, debut work that's getting a lot of push and hype. I think I got about 20 or 30% in and again, hated the writing. And it sort of felt like this book was trying to be insightful around like cancel culture and young people on the internet, but instead it just felt judgmental as hell. And it felt like it was really leaning into straw man sort of shit. And like, that's just not interesting to me. Okay, so those are all the books that didn't even make the cut. The books that I got the fuck out of really quickly. Or some not as fast as I should have, but you know what I mean. I couldn't even finish them. Now let's talk about the books that I did manage to finish, but that I'm kind of mad that I wasted my time on. Like I said, I don't think these are like the worst books ever written, but was I disappointed in them? Absolutely. The first one I want to talk about is Addie, LaRue by V.E. Schwab. Now, to be fair, this actually got a higher rating from me than a lot of other books did this year. And I have spoken about this and a lot of the books that we're going to be talking about in other videos. So I will leave links to those below if you want to hear my more detailed thoughts. Although, to be honest, the vlog in which I spoke about Addie LaRue was a very, very condensed version of what I really wanted to say about that book. I had so many criticisms. So what you got in that vlog was just a taster. And like I said in that video, the reason I was so disappointed in Addie LaRue is because I was primed and ready to fucking love this book. And in so many ways, I still really enjoyed reading it. I still liked a lot about Addie LaRue. There's a world in which this was my new favorite book of all time. You know what I mean? And yet it's instead on a list like this, which I think tells you all you need to know. Addie LaRue, I feel like is such a popular book, you probably have heard of it before, but basically it's like a low fantasy novel with a historical element. We follow Addie LaRue, who we meet first in like the 1700s in France, when she's in her early 20s and she's just got big dreams for herself. She doesn't want to just like get married and have kids like all the other stupid women in her town do. So she makes a little deal with the devil for her freedom, but obviously being a Faustian story, it comes at a price. And basically Addie's immortal, but no one will ever remember her. That is until 2014 in New York City in a bookshop, a boy named Henry remembers her. As in like he meets her once and then the next day they meet again and he remembers that he's seen her before. The first time this has ever happened in 300 years. And so they fall in love, obviously. Where to start with this book? I think at the end of the day, there's lots of problems with this book, but I think the biggest is Addie. As a main character, she is entirely hollow, superficial. What we're told about her is that she's spirited, she's curious, she wants to see the world, she wants to experience adventure. We're told all of this about her, and yet we do not see any evidence of that on page for a 550-page book spanning 300 years. This girl who wanted to see the world basically spends her 300 years in a couple of countries in Europe before heading over to the US, making this book feel weirdly Eurocentric and white-centric. Like, not every book is seeking to represent a whole host of different experiences and be diverse, right? But in a book spanning 300 years, in which we're following a character who supposedly wants to see and experience the world, it feels weird and only serves to highlight the limitations of the character of Addie. On top of that, the romances in this book make no sense. Like, I don't understand why anybody is into each other. Like, Addie spends most of her 300 years basically just like having one night stands over and over again, like a 51st Dates kind of thing. And it's just weird to me how like everybody just like falls madly in love with her. And like, why? She's not interesting. She's not engaging. She's just hot. I think the thing that is described most about Addie is the fact that she has 7 freckles that look like stars. And apparently that makes every philosopher and artist from the 1700s to the 21st century fall in love with her in the span of like a couple of hours. Also, and I suppose this is a little bit spoilery, the devil character that she made the deal with in the beginning also kind of falls in love with her. And like, why? I think it's sort of implied that it's because nobody has ever like resisted him for this long. Nobody has ever lasted 300 years. And I just like don't believe that. Like, he's acting like she's so mysterious and that he's never met anyone like her before. It's like, dude, you're a fucking god. And it's this bitch, this pretty girl with 7 freckles who thinks Europe is the height of culture and she doesn't have to go anywhere else to experience anything else. It's her that you're captivated by? What? Even Henry and Addie, like, I understand why they're drawn to each other. I understand why they might have this kind of like desperate clinging to each other. Romance though? Didn't see it. And the ending, I hated like that very final chapter. I didn't mind the moments before it, but that final chapter, it just made it feel like, what the fuck was the point? What was the point of reading all of this? Because it took great pains to remind us that by the end of the book, Addie was literally the same character that she was 300 years ago. No character development to be seen here whatsoever. I could go on, folks. I truly could go on. And I want to make it clear that I thought this writing was beautiful. I loved the atmosphere. And so while no, it's not the worst book I've ever read, it's not even my least favorite book of the year, I think it might be the most disappointing book I've read all year, simply because of how much potential was wasted. I feel like if I were a smart person, I would ease off the brake and pick a book that, you know, a lot of people don't like, but instead I'm going to pick this one. Orbital. Again, not a book that I hated. I read it before it was like shortlisted for the Booker and everything. I just don't know if sometimes like the literary world is having like a collective hallucination that I'm not in on, you know? That's how it felt. That's how it felt seeing this book win the Booker. Basically, this is a very slow literary book. It's not science fiction. I don't know why this is getting classed as science fiction. We're essentially just following some astronauts who are up on the International Space Station as they gaze out upon the pretty blue and green world and muse and muse and muse about how pretty and precious it is. It's very slice of life. Again, I feel like this is a book that I was primed to like. I like slow books that are about how wonderful and fragile life is, but I think the best word to describe this book was trite. I don't think Samantha Harvey had a single profound, unique thought in this book. In fact, I think I said in the video where I read this that it felt like the author had come across a bunch of like Hank Green TikToks and she decided to try and make that a literary work without actually having anything to say herself. One example that stands out so vividly in my mind, because I just kind of like couldn't believe that this was supposed to be profound and unique, was basically this 4-page kind of like retelling in pretty big words that idea that I don't know who originally kind of like presented it, but that idea that if you take like the lifespan of the universe, I think it is, or the lifespan of Earth, and kind of condense it to a year, that like humanity has only been around for like a few hours or whatever. The dinosaurs only existed like a month ago. I can't remember the details, but like that way of framing and thinking about time is very cool, but it's not a unique idea. Like Samantha Harvey did not come up with this. And so her spending 4 pages describing this year and trying to like frame time in this way as if it's so profound, honestly just kind of felt like the teacher's pet copying the nerdy science kid in the corner's homework. You know what I mean? And there was just a lot of that, a lot of regurgitated ideas. It was derivative. And so when it won the Booker, I was just flabbergasted. Like, I don't know what else to tell you. It's just the pretentious mediocrity that gets me. Okay, the Djinn waits 100 years. This was one of my most anticipated books of the year simply because it's about Djinn and I have a thing for Djinn, and because the cover is so pretty. Not a good reason to anticipate a book, I understand, but also it's like a gothic historical haunted house kind of story. That sounds like a good time. And look, this book is fine. It's fine. But who wants fine when they go into a book? You know, we want to be swept off our feet. So we want to have a great time. We want to have our hearts broken, you know. We don't want it just to be fine. I think this book needed more editing, and also I think what really kind of killed it for me in so many ways was the dialogue. There was just so much chatty back and forth dialogue that often felt entirely inconsequential to the scene, to the plot, and honestly just had the effect of stilting the flow, the atmosphere, everything else the author was kind of trying to build up. I don't know, this isn't necessarily a book that I want to tear apart, but I just don't think it was executed as well as it could have been. I think the concept and so much of the groundwork was incredible. And with all of this messy, unnecessary dialogue, it just kind of weighed the book down. And then by the end, it all just kind of fizzled out. Back to the beloved books, Middlegame. Honestly, as I said in the video where I read this, I should have DNF'd this. I should have DNF'd this at fucking 80 pages. I knew I wasn't going to love this book. Basically, this is kind of like a sci-fi fantasy, but like contemporary and urban, about 2 twins who are basically like created to be these magical embodiments of like the laws of the universe, but they were separated at birth. And it's both about their relationship, but also about them trying not to come under the control of people who want that access to all of that knowledge and power of the universe. The thing that I always hear people cite as the reason they love this book so much is the relationship between Roger and Dodger, these 2 twins. And like, they were fine, but like I didn't sink into their relationship in the way that I know so many other people did. I felt like we were told a lot about why we should care about it, but I didn't see it, which means that I didn't feel it. And the other thing, and I feel like people are just not going to believe me, but this book was so predictable. People say that this is so confusing and that you have to spend the first like 3/4 of the book just like trusting and like believing that the author will explain everything to you, which to be fair, she doesn't really. And when I say predictable, I'm not trying to tell you that I'm some genius who knew every single little detail. But like from 50, 80, 100 pages, I knew all of like the main beats of this book. I knew where this was heading. I got the gist. I didn't find the alchemy hard to understand. And I think one of the reasons it felt so fucking predictable is that the villain of this story is literally like a mustache twisting, like I was just waiting for him to cackle kind of villain. And I think he's supposed to be scary, but instead he was just kind of comical to me. And with all the flashbacks and everything, to me it was just like so obvious where this book was going. And so between that and like a comically bad villain, like I just didn't feel any of the tension. So it was fine, but like I didn't like it. I didn't have a good time. And considering it was 500 pages, I think I feel justified in being a little bit annoyed that I wasted so much time. Okay, now on to maybe one of the biggest books of the year. I feel like everybody loved this book. The Ministry of fucking Time. How? What? I just... Oh, I feel like I'm fucking losing my mind. This was a convoluted mess of nonsense. This is another book that I read in a video, and you will notice that I actually kind of was like vibing. I was into it for the first half. Basically, the setup for this is that we're following an unnamed main character who gets a job working at the Ministry of Time. And essentially her job is going to be like a personal assistant, more or less, but also kind of like a caretaker of somebody that the Ministry of Time has pinched from the past. And I can't even fucking remember his name, but he was some guy who was on an expedition to the North Pole, like 200 or 300 years ago. And so this guy is brought to the modern day, and our main character's job is to essentially acclimatize him to our modern world. And I'm a Doctor Who fan. I love a bit of timey-wimey shit, and like this was fun. The book then moved into this kind of like slice of life story of these two people just living with each other, and the history guy kind of just like figuring the fuck how to survive and how to make sense of our modern world. I really liked that portion of the book. I liked the slowness, the simpleness of it, and I liked too how there was an attempt by the book to explore some of the more like socio-political stuff that was going on between the two of them. How obviously he was very much a product of his time. He's a white guy living 200 years ago. I don't remember how many years ago. Hundreds of years ago. He had certain views about women and queer people and people of colour. And so watching these two characters kind of navigate that, especially given that our main character is a person of colour, white passing to an extent, but a person of colour, was just really interesting and kind of lovely to be in. But, and you know there's a big old but coming. The second half of this book just went off the fucking rails. This book became like a true full-blown romance with like open door explicit sex scenes, which like I'm not a prude, right? But like it just felt so weird. Not only the way that the book had started so slow and so lovely, but also this romance itself. I couldn't get invested because, I mean, one, the dude's a fucking racist, but two, the fact that he's in this kind of caretaker situation with her, and it turns out she is kind of obsessed with him, like she's been obsessed with history and knows all about him and his expedition. Like, it just felt really uncomfortable, like a weird kind of power dynamic that I didn't like. Almost like this Stockholm syndrome kind of romance. I didn't like it. But then as the book continues, it gets even more fucking weird because the Ministry of Time get involved again, and then it becomes like this spy book. Like, it is just trying to do so many different things, and it doesn't do any of them well. Also, while I appreciated some of the kind of socio-political commentary at the beginning, or like the exploration, the discussion, I don't think it was so much commentary. By the end, it felt so underdone, and like one of those books where we don't have to think about those icky things anymore because we're in love, you know? I just didn't like it. I didn't like anything that happened in like the second half of the book. Like the longer it went on, the more repulsed and angry and frustrated I became. But with that out of the way, we have made it to number 1. My least favorite book of the year has to be A Study in Drowning by Ava Reid. Now, I do know that this is a book that so many people love, and they really saw themselves in, particularly the main character, because so much of this book is essentially dealing with like PTSD, particularly as it pertains to young girls being abused and not being believed, and having to live with both of those things, the being abused and not being believed as they grow up, which is all kind of like neatly tied up in this fantasy kind of story in which our main character as a child was almost stolen by the Fairy King, but she managed not to be. But she remains terrified that he will come back for her. And basically nobody in her life believes her. We then meet her as she's older and she's going to college. And then she ends up winning a competition to design some guy's house, and they go there to learn more about like who an author was that she loved. I don't even remember. What I do remember is that there is one of the worst romances I have read in a long time in this book that I think is supposed to be portrayed as like healing and respectful and also just like really interesting and compelling, and it was none of those things. It was none of those things because, very unfortunately, Ava Reid decided to very clunkily insert like a kind of colonizer dynamic here, where our main character is from the country that is colonizing and occupying and oppressing her love interest's country. And so he is considered kind of like an underclass person to her. And she's just basically this world's version of fucking racist. But she is magically absolved of all of that racism and bigotry because she falls in love with this guy. And it's just icky. It's just really, really icky. I also don't love stories that center around healing from trauma through a relationship. Like that doesn't work for me. I understand that our relationships are essential for us, and supportive relationships in particular can help us heal. But I don't know what it is specifically about like essentially being portrayed as this like broken character who is healed because somebody else loves her. Like, I don't like that. It's an issue that I have had with romance as a genre and when it's incorporated as a subgenre into other things. Again, it just feels like this weird kind of power dynamic-y kind of thing, but also like this inferiority kind of thing. And it just makes me feel like you haven't really healed. Instead, it's like this codependence that you've created with somebody. I don't believe you. I don't believe that any healing has taken place. I think you're just feeling a little bit warm and fluffy because somebody thinks you're cute. And there's also something tangled up in all of that, where this idea that a man who is respectful of boundaries and is like cares about consent is somehow some beautiful magical thing that can heal somebody who has been traumatized. And that's why you're so in love with him, because he's so respectful, rather than that being the fucking bar. I don't know, this book just did not work for me. Like, it was very lush and prettily written. There were so many metaphors about water and drowning. So many metaphors, oh my god. But at least for me, the trauma and the romance I don't think were done well. And then to throw in that weird colonizer racist shit, like, no thank you. No thank you. Anyway, it's just started literally bucketing down with rain, and I feel this desperate urge to like run out in it and cleanse myself after this. Anyway, if you feel like carrying on this hater train with me, I would love to hear what your least favorite books of the year were and why. A big thank you as always to my Patreons, and especially big thank you to Livia, Lynette Brown and Marie. Anyway, I feel like we've both heard enough of my voice for today, so I'm going to leave it there. Thanks so much for hanging out with me. Until next time, happy reading. Bye.